Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Canadian Philosophy Show. I'm your host, Tagen Marshall, and you're in for a very exciting topic tonight. With me, I have two co-hosts, Nicole Kirigin and Michael Robert Caditz, and my opening question to them today is, what is your favorite part about Canada?
I can go first. My favorite part about Canada is our wilderness.
Nature is a wonderful thing. What about you, Mikey?
Okay, I'm going to say that it's the relative sense of peace and quiet that Canada, since we are going to be talking about the United States, in contrast, I'll say that having
Don't give the topic away.
Oh.
Well, that's all right. Continue.
There's not the hatred and polarization and tribalism in Canada. It's people are roughly have a rough sense of community here. I think the good of the society and the good of the community. It's a strong value here in Canada.
All right. Well, I'm sure we'll get into that in our conversation. And as Mikey's already alluded to, we're going to be talking about our neighbor, the United States, because tonight's topic is the difference between Canadian and United States in terms of culture, which will lead into identities, which will, of course, lead into politics and all that fun jazz. So, as I was thinking and preparing for the show, I figured I'd begin with a statement from both countries. Because to understand what separates Canada from the United States, as much as what unites us to the United States and vice versa, you must understand each country's founding and chief document, the Constitution. For us, that's the Constitution Act, us Canadians, and for the U.S., it's the Constitution of the United States of America. Go figure. So, I did want to begin by reading opening statements from both. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, provide for the common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Do ordain and establish this Constitution of the United States of America. And now I'll go to the Constitution Act, which was originally written in 1867 and adapted in 1982. The act says, an act for the unification of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick, and the government therefore, and for purpose connected therewith. Whereas the provinces of Canada, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick have expressed their desire to be federally united into one dominion under the crown of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, with a constitution similar to the principle to that of the United Kingdom. And I'll just read that first paragraph, but it does go on. Actually, why not read the whole thing? We're this far along. And whereas such union would conduce what? 1 second. Conduce to the welfare of the provinces and promote the interests of the British Empire. And whereas on the establishment of the Union by the authority of Parliament, it is expedient not only that the Constitution of the legislative authority in the Dominion be provided for, but also that the nature of the executive government therefore be declared. And whereas it is expedient that the provinces be made pardon my poor reading skills here, eventual admission into the Union of other parts of British North America. So, I want to get your thoughts on those two statements. What resonated? What questions do you have? And then we'll get into it. Nicole, why don't you go first?
Can you tell me what exactly you want me to comment on regarding the two statements? And I guess maybe like a refresher on what the statements are. I was listening, but they're very long. So I don't know if I retained all of that.
No problem. Well, I guess I'm wondering which out of those two statements do you resonate more with in terms of values and ideas that they put forth?
I don't know, because all I retained was British North America, so I don't really,
Okay.
I can't, yeah, you come back to me.
Okay, Mikey, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I know we hear what we want to hear, and each of us may hear different things. But what stood out for me in your reading of the preamble to the U.S. Constitution was the themes of liberty, something about peace and order, I think, security or peace or something like that. And what stood out in your reading of the Canadian counterpart was the theme of unity. There was a lot of talk of unity, right? Unity of Nova Scotia and so on with Nova Scotia.
Right.
And I think for me, that's significant, and it is reflective of some deep distinctions between the two countries, and I'm sure we'll get into that. But that's a short answer to your question.
Yeah. When I look at these two statements, it's important to note the differences in the history of each country. And there's a very key distinction which I covered in my political studies course. And that distinction is quite simply the role of the crown. The people, the founding fathers of the United States, pushed for independence from the crown. And this is a contrast to our Constitution, which states that we will still be cooperating with the crown. That's a deciding distinction, which I think informs the development of our culture and our society. Because with independence, with not only actual freedom of self-governance, but it also implies more responsibility on the individual. And note how the American Constitution says we the people who fought in the Civil War, the people who wrote the Federalist Papers, literal essays which were published in newspapers at the time, defending the necessity of the Constitution of America as it was being adopted. I don't see, and I think it's actually impossible to see or to deny the differential in the actual wording of our Constitution. Now, some of the qualities like liberty and equality are shared between the two. Now, granted, that is a translation of the Constitution. But I would say that the U.S. Constitution more clearly lays out the desires of the fabric of the country, whereas the Canadian Constitution is a little more legalistic in its approach to say, in these provinces coming together, we then will strive. Versus saying we as individuals come together as a collective to make the United States. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, the United States is very focused on individuals, and Canada has more of a deeply rooted value in the collective, and as you were just saying. And just a couple clarifications on what you said, Tagen. It wasn't the Civil War, but it was the Revolutionary War that the American colonies fought. The 13 colonies fought to throw off the British rule, and it was. I would say it's stronger than you said it. More strongly, it wasn't that the American those who created the American Constitution were trying to distance from England. It was a war. I mean, they fought a war. People died. A lot of people died. They fought a war and won the war, the Revolutionary War against England. So it was not a cooperative relationship at all. They were enemies, sworn enemies, the American settlers and the Crown. Whereas, as you pointed out, in Canada's relationships with the Crown was more one of cooperation. But I also wanted to point out that the equality and liberty that is attributed to the American founding fathers, it was attributed to just that. It should be attributed to just that, the fathers, males. And not only that, but male landowners. And they had slaves, many of them. So the liberty and equality that was enshrined in the U.S. Constitution at the time was quite racist and quite sexist, and it was only a certain social class of people that were entitled to this liberty and equality.
Nicole, what are your thoughts?
Don't necessarily align myself entirely with the American Constitution in terms of that like individualism kind of emphasis there, but I don't like that the Canadian Constitution reduces the individual into groups, into provinces. I think that it's almost using people as pawns for a greater purpose, and I think that people can both be a part of a group and help the collective, and also have elements of their individualism there. But I wish that it was more balanced in the Canadian perspective.
Right. I mean, we here, or at least I do, will try to run and tread carefully when dealing with this subject, because I know it is a hot button issue for sure, especially in the midst of political atmospheres on both sides. When we talk about the differences between Canadian between Canada and the US in terms of culture. We must understand what culture means. Culture refers to, and this is going off the top of my head, I have no definition in front of me. Culture refers to a series of customs or expectations, ways of life which are passed down and become a part of societal norms. And all this arises basically from not only just convention over the years, expectation, but as I've already stated, the actual founding documents of the respective countries. And just a clarification on what I said earlier, I did not mean to downplay the Revolutionary War. What I was referring to as coming together to make the United States, I was referring to the defense of the Constitution. I was referring to the Federalist Papers themselves, not to discount the sacrifice that those individuals went through for freedom. So with this in mind, this is going to be a highly political conversation. There's no way to escape it. But before we do a full-scale deep dive, we've already talked about how Canada is more, or seems to be more, about a collective community, a collective process, whereas the US is based on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, can I say, like...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, like I like the idea of community, and I really do like that idea. I just think that, and maybe the Canadian Constitution does this, but I think that there should be an account for both community and also who we are as individuals, and I think that would be the optimal and ideal kind of constitution if I had my own country, of course, but I don't.
Okay, so let me kind of talk about the three areas that I want to discuss. Right now we're into the constitutional phase, which is good, because the Constitution is formative. I will then compare the two political systems and the ideals within each. And then we can have a discussion of what our experiences have been as Canadians, or I think we're all Canadians. Well, we are all Canadians regardless, but our experience being in Canada, what that's been like, and we can just take some questions after that. Sound good with everybody? Great. So let me begin with the fact that, and this kind of deals with what you were asking about, Nicole, is the individualism within Canada. And when I was taking my political studies course and reading through the text, I'll give the name of it just in case anyone's interested. It's called The Canadian Regime, and I was working from the 7th tradition, I believe, by Malcolmson and Myers, two Canadian authors in political science. And they talked about the difference in our political system is that Canada is founded on, as the Constitution itself states, our Constitution is based off of one of the British Empire. It's based off the British model, whereas the US is based on, the US is technically a republic. And so but Canada functions politically in what we would call, and so does the US, here's a similarity. They both focus on what is called a liberal democracy. Meaning that we don't have full democracy, because as Aristotle points out, full democracy, more often than not, at least in his time, and probably still now, leads to mob rule. So the founding fathers of Canada, we'll focus on Canada, saw the value in having a limited form of democracy in which, based on the theory, the British theory of responsible government. Responsible government focuses on keeping the legislative powers accountable to the electorate. And the so Parliament is held accountable to the electorate, which is the all voting members. However, as Malcolmson and Myers and a former MP in particular, Brett Rathgaber, points out, we as Canadians do not elect governments. We elect representatives. And I think that's interesting, because we elect representatives to ensure that, in the hopes anyway, that they would act within the interest of the people who elected them, so their constituents. And it is the same way in the US. However, the US is not based on responsible government. It's based on the principles of federalism. So I want to see, before I go into that, Mikey or Nicole, had you heard of responsible government before? Do you have anything to add? Any questions you want me to answer?
Well, when you talk about responsible government, John Rawls comes to mind. So John Rawls, in his exposés on the theory of democracy, of liberal democracy, talks about public officials being held accountable, about there being transparency in the decision-making process of public officials, and public officials should be held accountable to explain the rationality of their decisions. So John Rawls suggests that that is one of the important principles of democracy. And what that brings to mind, Tagen, and maybe we can incorporate this into our thoughts, is there's not an identity between the theory of government structure, so Canada being a constitutional monarchy, technically, the United States being a constitutional republic, and the differences in the way that the representatives are elected and the way that the head of state is elected. We can talk. You might want to. Maybe you'll talk about the differences there in U.S. versus Canada, because the election process is different. But that's all theoretical. That's all the theoretical structure of government. But Rawls talks about the actual substantive, substantive requirements for a democracy. So you could have a country, and we do have countries, which have the shell. Even constitutions which outline the shell of a democratic process. Russia, North Korea, I mean, they have elections, they have representatives, they have legislatures, but it's the substance that, in my view, determines whether a country is a democratic, liberal nation or not. It's not what's on paper; it's what actually happens. So my argument would be that if you want to gauge the whether a country is democratic, you have to look at least as much, if not more, at the substance compared to the Constitution or what's on paper. There are many, many countries that have constitutions which, if you read the Constitution alone, you would say, oh, wow, that's a great democracy. But if you look at the actual practice, it's not a democracy.
Interesting, Nicole. You wanna either expand or respond to that, please? We can't hear you, Nicole.
Oh, you can't?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay, I said you can come back to me.
Okay, all right. You get to hear more of my voice then. Yay. But that's what I'm here for. So I think that's interesting, and I mean, with conversations of constitutions, like this is way bigger of a topic than we'll have time to cover tonight. But I guess Mikey and Nicole, I'll ask this to kind of drive it a little bit. What do you think being Canadian actually means? What do you think being a member of Canada actually means? Because to me it means I am a member of Canada. I am a member of that society, and under ideal conditions, I uphold the values set forth in that society. And this kind of reaches into questions of constitutional supremacy, because the way I interact as a Canadian is not only going to be shaped by my experience, although it's primarily my experience, but those experiences are also shaped by the way our country responds, the way our country was founded. So how might the differential between responsible government, which is a unification of powers, meaning the executive branch, so the Prime Minister's office, the legislative branch, the Senate and the House of Commons, the legislature, and the judicial are fused together. They cooperate. Versus within the US, in federalism, you have a separation of powers, meaning that each office, the executive, the office of the president, the Senate, House of Representatives, all that jazz, and the judiciary are separate and operate independently. It's a fundamental shift from what we have seen. So how do you think that impacts the culture at large? So say Canada has a separation of powers. How might that impact how you feel as a Canadian? Does that make you feel more independent or less independent? Mikey, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm not sure I can agree with you that it's so black and white, the distinction between Canada and the United States. I mean, clearly the United States system of government is designed around the principle of separation of powers of the three branches of government. But I don't think that there's no separation in Canada. Certainly there's an independent judiciary.
Right.
The judiciary can make decisions which are not subject to the ratification or rubber stamp by the executive. So I'm not sure it's that clear cut. But having said that, the idea behind the American separation of powers is that the theory is that it will create checks and balances, and the theory is that will lead to a more democratic government because the to the extent that the legislative branch and the judiciary check and balance the executive, that in theory will prevent a dictator from wielding power, because even the president, right, even the executive branch is subject to being checked and monitored by the other branches of government. So that's the theory, one of the theories behind it.
Correct.
Yeah.
Mikey, I agree that it's not so black and white, but just for the sake of time, I went with the clear distinctions, because actually, let's talk about that. So, what's interesting about the Canadian Judiciary, which is fundamental to enacting laws and determining whether laws are constitutional or not, is the fact that they practice independence and I'm trying to think back now. Independence and I can't. They're independent from the executive, but they work with the executive versus fully apart from it. So for example, an interesting case we have coming up through the Supreme Court right now is lockdown challenges. Are the lockdown measures in place by the government's constitutionally, appropriate? And the test for that is called the Oakes test. And so what these lockdowns will have to pass is, because under Section 2 of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the government does have the right, under sufficient cause, justified cause, to override the freedoms that we have. And so what's going to happen within the Supreme Court, if it gets there, is the question of, A, is this justified? And B, basically, don't quote me on this, but basically, is it the only option? And so we are going to have to, it's going to be interesting to see what that result is. And like, there's so much we could get into here about the differences and similarities. And for some reason, things just aren't. Well, I mean, because government's government, and this is a complex issue. The train of thought I have in my head has all of a sudden escaped me. So let's just ask, what do you think is one fundamental aspect that, okay, we'll do two questions, that unites Canada and the US? And then what's one thing that you think distinguishes?
I would say something that unites Canada and the U.S. is a commitment to a free market capitalist economic system, although there's differences and there are formulations in each country. And another thing that unites Canada and the U.S. is theoretically, at least, stated acceptance of the ideas of principles of universal human rights and democracy in theory. What distinguishes, in my view, what distinguishes the U.S. and Canada more than anything else, and we've talked about this today and we talked about it on previous shows, is, in my view, and I believe I can support this. Not enough time to go into it now, but in detail. But in my view, the central to the U.S. psyche, to the American psyche, is what's called radical libertarianism. The idea of liberty and freedom for the individual to pursue his or her, actually it was his in the founding of the United States, happiness. And we've talked about this in the context of ecological space and ecological footprint and personal autonomy. And I don't think that same value is central to Canadian culture. As Nicole was saying, and as you were talking about, Tagen, I think the idea of unity and cooperation is much stronger in Canadian culture than it is in American culture. And another example of how that manifests, and we've had a show on this, is freedom of speech. So we've talked about how in the United States, the courts and the U.S. Supreme Court has consistently over the decades rejected any attempt to curb freedom of speech, even when that speech is deemed to be hate speech. Whereas in Canada, by and large, over the decades, the Supreme Court of Canada has upheld laws, provincial laws, municipal laws, designed to prevent people from speech that is deemed to be harmful to vulnerable minorities. That's a fundamental difference. So in the former case, the United States has chosen personal liberty, and in the latter case, Canada has chosen the good, the good of the overall society, or the good or the welfare of vulnerable people, even if it means that some people have to give up their liberty.
Nicole, would you like to add on to that, or?
Yeah, so like the I guess how similar Canadian culture is with U.S. culture, as original question. Yeah, I was thinking that culture-wise, there is a lot of overlap. I'm looking at social media, for example. Canadians in general will consume the same type of social media, the same kind of YouTube videos, overall in general, not always, as Americans. And I think that really influences how much, I guess, we think in alignment with people in the US. I think that we consume a lot of the same things like entertainment and popular culture. And I think that is really shown through social media. There's not really that much of a divide between, American social media and Canadian social media. It's very much so an overlap.
Right. Okay. To answer my own question, I think what unites Canada and the United States is the fact that to varying degrees there is a recognition of is the fact that both Canada and the United States are very multicultural. I mean, this has been a major focus of Canada in particular, is that Canada has become known as a melting pot for people all over the world, right? And I think that brings a unique aspect to our society, because you have all these different aspects and experiences and beliefs and ideas, right, which seep into our social psyche. And so I think that could be one aspect that unites us. I think, Mikey, I want to go with your point a little more and push it a little bit to say, and since we have Nicole with us, and I know Nicole's a Nietzsche fan herself, I want to ask this question. Mikey, you said that Canada works for the common good of the greater society, and sometimes that means sometimes that means that individuals must give up their liberty. How is that not an example of a master society crushing down the slave a little bit? Or does that work?
The reason it's not an example of that is that when I said that sometimes people have to give up their liberty for the good of others, I didn't mean all of their liberty. It's only particular abilities to do certain things. So if somebody is told, you can't get up on a pulpit or on a podium and make racist comments or make disparaging comments about Indigenous people, you're not giving up all of your liberty in your life. It's just that particular thing that you need to take more responsibility around. So the answer to your question is that I don't believe that either the Canadian government or the Canadian society is, in general, constraining people's liberty, except in particular situations, whereas you described, sometimes the Supreme Court of Canada will decide that in this particular case. So in the case of, maybe they haven't decided this yet, but they may decide that in the case of restrictions and lockdowns and so on related to the pandemic, that in this particular case, the overall goal of public health supersedes the individual liberties in this particular case. So maybe I don't have the liberty to go sit in a restaurant, or I don't have the liberty to go, go to a soccer game or something in a crowd of people. But that doesn't mean I don't have any liberty in my life. It just means those particular things I have to forego temporarily for the greater good. So I think that's what Canada represents, not a master society of oppression and stomping on people's liberties left and right.
Perspective. So I think that if we are to allow the government to have that kind of power, right, I think that we're making the assumption that the government always knows what's best for its people, right? So in that sense, I think it would be analogous with Nietzsche's master morality, slave morality kind of conception, because if you do give that power, you are assuming that with a reasonable amount of understanding there, you are assuming that they always know what's the best for you, and I don't necessarily think that's true. And also the thing that I have a hard time coming to terms with, and I'm still on the fence about, is what's good for the rest of society is not necessarily what's good for you as an individual. And then to what extent for you as an individual should you give up whatever is good for you for the greater good of everybody else, right? I think if you can reasonably say that most other people in society are doing the same thing, they're giving up some of their personal liberties for the good of everybody, and then it kind of comes back around to help you overall, in other in other contexts. I think that you can say that, but I'm a bit more cynical in saying that I don't think that, even though our society is set up in a way that says that we should be helping everybody else, I don't think that many people really try to help other people before helping themselves. And for that reason, I don't trust the sentiment that I should be giving up, things that are good for me for the good of everybody else, because I don't think that most people are thinking along that way. But then it's a hard balance, right? Because I think it is also an individual decision, because you can say, okay, can I give up, for example, going to a restaurant to help somebody else? I think that that's arbitrary enough for me to say, yes, I can do that. But when it's something more serious, I don't know, about the trade-off there.
Mikey, do you want to jump in, or can I take this?
Yeah, let me just invoke John Rawls again, because one of the pillars of John Rawls' theory of democracy is the concept of the overlapping consensus. And John Rawls very clearly distinguishes between what he calls a modus vivendi, which is a balance of power on one hand and an overlapping consensus on the other. And Rawls clearly states that a modus vivendi is not the goal in a democratic society. The goal is not to have individual comprehensive doctrines fighting each other, fighting for their own perceived benefit, for their own power, and then somehow you reach an equilibrium where everyone has exercised their power to its greatest extent, and you have some sort of society. And Rawls argues that that is not a stable society. It's not a democracy. It's not stable because as soon as the power shifts, then you have a disruption in society, in the balance of power. So Rawls argues that there should be an overlapping consensus. And the overlapping consensus entails that individual comprehensive doctrines, which I think by extension would also include individuals, but certainly individual subcultures, individual religions, individual groups with certain values, may sometimes have to give up their individual liberties for the good of the overlapping consensus. And it's that overlapping consensus which creates stability and longevity and sustainability in a society. So in my view...
I agree with you.
What? You go ahead.
I agree with you.
Go ahead,
I agree with you that that's what it should be, right? But in reality, I don't think we can ever reach a society that's not, going with a modus vivendi, like trying to just appease each other and go with something for the sake of argument, even though they don't necessarily all agree. I think if we're trying to I agree with the sentiment that a society is more stable if everybody in general agrees with each other, right? But I don't think it's possible to have a society like that unless we suppress people's I guess authentic selves. So, and what I'm saying that I know that most people will fall within an average in terms of what they believe, what they do. There's going to be always that kind of herd mentality that's kind of in popular culture that's always going to be coexisting with the majority of people, and that means that the majority of people will think the same on about a lot of things. But I would say around 20% of people or so, just throwing out a number there. But I would say that it's unless you suppress those people and those people that are, I guess, on the fringes of society, you won't be able to have an overall agreement over something. And then, couldn't you argue that if you are trying to suppress that 20% of society, isn't that like a form of discrimination? You could make that argument there, right? So that then, how can everybody live in a consensus if you're not suppressing people who are on the fringes of society? And is it ethical to then suppress people who are on the fringes of society if they don't agree with the collective? I'm not sure if I would agree with that.
I'll let Mikey respond, and then I'm gonna jump in here.
Yeah, I'll make my response short. It's important that we don't strawman Rawls' argument about the overlapping consensus. I don't believe that overlapping consensus entails that everyone agree. What it entails is that in some cases, people need to give up the implementation, their desired implementation, for the greater good. And I'll give one simple example of an overlapping consensus and how it's been threatened in the United States. So you had Trump was in office for 4 years, and then there was an election which Biden finally won. But it's been overwhelmingly documented that Trump and the Republicans tried to prevent the Biden from getting office. They tried in many different ways to subvert and overturn the popular will. And so that would be an example of an individual comprehensive doctrine. That would be the Trump supporters ignoring the overlapping consensus and instead pursuing their own comprehensive doctrine. The overlapping consensus would dictate that you concede when you lose the election. You don't agree. The Republicans could still say, or the Trump supporters could still say, we are very scared of what Biden might do or what the Democrats might do, and we don't agree with the platform. But in the interest of the nation, in other words, the overlapping consensus, we will concede the election. We don't agree, but we will concede the election, and that is what Rawls is talking about as the overlapping consensus.
Okay.
That sounds like modus vivendi. That sounds like the exact definition of it. Which is, I'm just going to Google a quick definition: a feasible agreement or practical compromise, especially one that bypasses difficulties. So I don't see how that, like, what you're explaining is different from that first step there that Rawls tried to get past, which is modus vivendi. I don't know. Like, I could be completely misunderstanding. So, yeah.
We knew we were gonna get here at some point, and now we're here. Individuals have the right to disagree, whether we like it or not, whether it's heated or not. There is the fundamental right that individuals have to disagree. But where the consensus is within the Constitution. What every Canadian, what every American has to submit to ultimately is the Constitution. Now we can see issues within the Constitution and push for amendments. But ultimately, if you're looking for that one thing of which every individual must consent to, that is adhering to the Constitution and the laws of which it sets out. And then we go from there. When we talk about the most recent election, we won't get into it because it's controversial, it gets heated. There's a lot of emotions. But whether we agree with individuals' actions, which most would disagree with, or at least a vast majority, individuals still have the right to protest that result. That cannot be taken away. Now, how that may manifest in certain individuals, that's ultimately up to the individual. And as Nicole has stated, if we were to get rid of that, right, it's no longer free and open society. So, anyways, what do you guys think of my statement that the consensus comes with submitting to the Constitution?
Well, I think it's problematic, Tagen, because the Constitution must be interpreted. Now, there's a philosophy subscribed to by some in the United States. It's called the constitutionalists. They believe that the Constitution should be interpreted literally. And
constitutional originalism.
And there's some problems with that. One problem is no matter how hard you try, there's still going to be interpretation involved because you're looking at words on a piece of paper, and we've studied in philosophy of language how words are inadequate to specify thoughts and concepts, right? Bertrand Russell developed a whole system of formal logic as he understood that language, that grammar was prone to error and to disputes and to different ways of interpreting. So when you're looking at a written document, you're trying to find concepts and meaning and specificity in grammar, and it's really not possible. So that's one problem with the constitutionalist or the originalist argument. The second problem is that as a matter of value and policy, is it really appropriate or is it really just to attempt to literally interpret a document that was written several hundred years ago when the writers of that document could not and did not foresee many of the developments in the world? I mean, there's nothing in the U.S. Bill of Rights about about nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction, and yet there are some originalists who say that that it would be violation of the intention of the founding fathers to try and regulate guns. Even automatic or semi-automatic weapons, because it says right there in the Constitution that the Congress shall make no law abridging the rights of citizens to have weapons. But the founding fathers who wrote the Bill of Rights didn't anticipate the type of weapons that are available now. So those are two problems with the originalist position.
Oh boy, oh man, there's so much here. There's so much. And we're running out of time, so Nicole, you can quickly have the last thought and then we'll start wrapping up.
Like, my question is that if you are a citizen, or I would say like a permanent resident of Canada, you do have to abide to the Constitution legally. But do you really have like a choice if, let's say, you're born into the country, right? Like, just because you're born into a country, like, it assumes consent. And I find that, like, practically, I think it has to be like that. But if we're talking about philosophically, I'm not sure if being born into something is enough of like a consent to actually agree to something. So that's kind of my question there.
And it's too big a question for me to answer with any quality response, other than to be born into a country, to be a member of a country, that is where education becomes necessary. Because, and this is why, the text I referenced was written, because it came out of a realization that a large majority of Canadians do not understand the political system. And in order to fully take part and participate, there must be a greater understanding and greater comprehension of the founding of a country. As for the living constitutionalist versus constitutional originalism, I vote that we do a show on that in the future. But until then, because I have some very strong opinions on that topic, that truth is truth and cannot be subjective, especially in the founding of a country. But anyway, there you go. I buried the explanation. My name is Tagen Marshall. I'm here with Nicole Kirigin, Michael Roberts, Caditz. Thank you so much to our radio stations that carry us, VIU and SFU, and we hope you'll have a wonderful evening. Next week, tune in for a conversation of, do we live in a simulation? Bye, everyone.